Leadermorphosis, the podcast exploring the emerging world of self-organizing teams and progressive organizations.
So, Meg, I thought we could start by talking about leadership, because I know that part of your work is helping individuals and teams evolve their leadership capacity. And you have this really nice sentence on your website about helping us shift from independent leaders to interdependent leaders. And I know you've done a lot of research about this as well. So I was wondering if you could share something about what you've learned, both from your research and in your own experience and work, about evolving our leadership capacity and how do we move to this more interdependent kind of leadership?
Sure. Research might be too grand a word for what I've done. I've done a lot of reading and thinking. I also spent 6 months on this beautiful thing called a learning marathon. It's a marathon because it's 26 weeks, and it's like a choose your own adventure mini masters for people who can't quite get their head around doing a master's. And so my question was around how do we support people moving from being independent to interdependent leaders. So I spent 6 months, which was the middle of a couple of years of looking into this stuff. So when you look at adult development and some of the research that's been done around adult development, there are stages that adults can go through, not all adults do, to change the lens that we look at complexity and mess through. And when you look at young adults, so 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, there's often a strong sense of wanting to belong and be part of something that already exists. And some people spend their whole lives just like with a reasonably contained worldview of knowing what the rules are and wanting to be able to be like a good team member. And there's pluses and minuses to that. Somewhere around the middle of people's this happens at lots of different times, but somewhere around the middle of people's 20s, maybe later on, people begin to want to stand out for their expertise. And so we begin to follow a thread, want to be seen to be doing good work. And so we move to a different phase, which the literature calls expert, where we have expertise, and we learn about problem solving, and we learn how our style of problem solving is, and the people at this stage start to think in slightly longer time horizons of like 3 months to a year, and are really good at solving problems, and lots of people stay there for a long time. And there's a movement potentially then of developing more strategic thinking. Often, and one of the key authors in the field wrote a book called In Over Our Heads, and that's often the trigger for people to grow. I was just coaching a client yesterday, and we were talking about the fact that she felt in over her head didn't mean she was failing. It meant she had potential to grow, because those are the times when we're going, I'm at the edge of my current map, I'm at the edge of my current skills. And so the final stage of independent leadership is moving beyond expert to there's different words that some of the different scholars use, but I tend to think of it achiever. And these are people who, if you think in the Western model of what a good leader would be traditionally, this is all those things. This is your MBA, thinking strategically, systems thinking, understanding that you have to bring people on board to your vision, like all those good things. And that's great, right? Like that means we need people who do that in order to run complex organizations. There's still, at that stage, the leader is still in the center. So they may be doing lots of consultation, they may maybe bring lots of people in, but it's still ultimately them making the decisions. So there's something interesting, and this is the place where I'm often working with people, is in the transition when people get really good at hitting the numbers, getting stuff done inside their organization, and then they look up and see the rest of the world is broken, that there are so many bigger problems. They also often, and this is a key part of the transition, begin to do quite a lot of soul searching around their place in the world and what their purpose is. And with good nurturing, or just a lot of soul searching and maybe struggle, people move to an interdependent view. And the first of those kind of two major interdependent lenses is often called redefining, because you begin to want to change the system. And this is maybe slightly a volatile stage, because you want to just burn it all down and recreate it. But this does mean that people are having much deeper empathy for other people. They deeply realize that they only have one part of the truth. And whereas an interdependent leader, the later stage, would bring people together because they understand that involvement creates engagement with their own vision. Someone at the interdependent stage would bring people together because they just know that's the only way we deal with complex situations. You have to bring the people together who are involved. Now, my hunch, and it's not just my hunch, is that we need more leaders who are at the interdependent stage in order to do all these things that we talk about, in order that we look at self-managed organizations, in order that teal or whatever lens we're going to look through organizational development, we need leaders who have this interdependent lens. There's a couple more stages beyond redefining where people settle more in, but that's the common stage, and that's kind of where I tend to work with people.
I'm wondering if, given what you just said, like, do you think it's possible if, as a leader, I'm at the independent stage and either I or someone in my organization chooses we're going to become a self-managing organization, do you think that would be a catalyst for them starting to embark on a journey into the interdependent stage? And if so, what kind of support would they need, or how could we help them navigate that transition?
Yeah, and this is my internal research question at the moment, and my inquiry, and I have some hunches. Yes, I think potentially moving to more self-managed organizations could be a trigger. One of the problems is that when you begin to do that deeper soul-searching work of finding who you are and what your place is in the world, and bringing more people in and thinking with longer timelines, spotting more than annual patterns, and people around you who are at particularly strong independent lenses, I think you might be going off the rails a bit.
Yeah, it doesn't look like leadership.
You're losing your edge, or like you were so good and now you're being less effective. And so my instinct is that we need to hold a space to nurture people so they see there's a path. And sometimes that's what I'm doing as a coach, is going, it's okay, you're not broken, like this is growth, and here's the next stages. And in fact, when people come across the action logics model, or the vertical development model, which is kind of what we're talking about, the people it really appeals to are people who are moving into redefining. In fact, sometimes when one of the characteristics, like unofficially, of people being in redefining is they become obsessed with the model and start seeing it everywhere, which is an important stage. And I went through it too, of really using it to, and you begin to see everything, and you begin to see why you're not engaging people, and you become quite passionate about it because you actually see a path ahead for you. And it's only when you really settled into the stage after that, which is reasonably rare, to be honest, where you see the world is broken, you see how tiny a part you can play, and somehow you get some sense of that being okay, and you're much steadier. So you don't necessarily just want to burn it all down, though I still do want to burn quite a lot of things. But you, in fact, a friend WhatsApped me yesterday to say she was a bit lost, felt like she was shouting into the void, and like how could she find her place where she was making the most difference. And I think that's a really key question that happens with interdependent people, is, or when people develop that more expanded worldview, we have to be a little bit careful that it doesn't become a hierarchy, because it's not a personality test, which is why they talk about vertical development and horizontal development. So you'll have all your Myers-Briggs, all your DISC, all your Enneagram types at all of the levels, at all of the action logics. It really just depends on what life has pushed at you, on where you've been over your head, that forces you to evolve. Some people in quite technical environments, academia, engineering, the law, can live very happily as experts for the rest of their life because no one needs them to develop outside of that siloed thinking, and they do their job very well. It causes a problem for organisations because sometimes there's quite a lot of short-termism in terms of the timelines that people are looking at. So I'm just returning to your question. So yes, I think it can, being part of a self-managed organisation can be a trigger, but I don't think it's enough without having a map to go, these are some of the things that happen during change, because otherwise that kind of organisational change can be pretty terrifying for people.
And I think that's when you get these knee-jerk reactions and these articles like, self-management nearly killed my startup and things like that, where people, express this ambition to become self-organizing and suddenly they don't know what leadership looks like in that new world. And the kind of old paradigms don't really work, but they're sort of not sure what the next action logic is, I guess. Like, where do I go now? And then through that lens, it's very easy to see this is chaos, or this isn't working, or people need to be led, and go back to a kind of more traditional top-down hierarchy.
And people want that as well. Like, so they, and the other thing that occurs to me is I think you could probably implement a version of self-management in quite an expert way. Like you could read about it and get excited about it, and you could implement it in a way which was quite technical and doesn't necessarily have the soul of it there. And also, you have to. So there's a kind of rule of thumb that we can tend to be able to see into the next action logic. So where we're at, we can see people who have the next stage of expansion, and even see some appeal to it. But if people are one stage further on, so 2 stages away from us, they just become enigmatic. So I had a client who was deeply in the transforming stage, which is the stage after redefining. And she, I remember her saying that she'd gone to her exec board and was really excited about this study about this that an Indian soil scientist had done, and how it gave really clear lessons for their business. And the business that she was in was a professional services business, like lots of people who live in the expert zone, and it was like they literally did not know what she was talking about. And for her, it was transparent. Like, of moss? Do you see how the microbes in the soil? In fact, that's one of the ways you can sometimes spot people who are at those later stages, is they often use gardening metaphors.
Yeah.
Talk about the soil and the seeds.
Yes.
And nurturing, because you're looking at a less linear approach. You're looking at something that is more like nature, that is more about ecosystems and holding the circumstances for success, and planting things and allowing things to grow over time, because you're able to have those longer timelines. But when your sense of self is very linked to the expertise that you have, and you're thinking in 3 month to a year timelines, and someone's thinking in 10, 20-year timelines, it can feel like things are totally out of control, and it can have a bad effect on people's morale. I've had that experience in a client.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are then about as a group of people in an organization wanting to support each other and move towards a vision or a purpose. What can we do in terms of holding space for people who are at different action logics levels? And I guess it sounds like both you've been working with this, helping clients of yours, and also have gone on this journey yourself. So what would your advice be in that sense?
One of the things, let me see if I can find it this way. So I'm also a presentation coach. I've been for a long time, and just revisiting the book that I wrote 4 years ago right now in a series of videos, and seeing what I know and kind of looking at it through the lens of me having a different action logic than when I wrote the book. And one of the things that I'm aware of is that different things resonate with people when they're at different stages. And when you're putting across your vision, for example, like if you've got some people who are at the belonging stage, some people who are at problem solving stage, some people who are at strategic stage, some people who over the interdependent, whatever, who are more about holding the space and creating culture, then you really need to be able to code switch and kind of get over yourself a little bit about always talking about the soil samples. Like, you may have to, and this becomes a skill, I think, of when you really settle into your new vision on the world, is that you really are able to connect with the actual people who are in front of you. Otherwise, what are you doing? So I think there needs to be an awareness that these changes literally don't happen overnight. So let's say 3 to 5 years for people to move from one stage to the next, if they were on some sort of path. But people stay in some stages for decades or for their whole life. That there will be people in your organization who are going to feel really unsafe if they don't know what to do, how to be a good team member. And so that your self-managing vision needs to be translated into those ways. Some people are very certain of their own perspective and are very clear on their expertise and are really good at solving their problems. So they need to know, how does the thing you're suggesting solve problems, and problems that are relevant for them? Otherwise, they're going to go, well, this is all great, but we need to really just focus on the basics. We need to focus on the fundamentals. People who are more strategic need to know, how is this going to lead towards business outcomes and business goals and hitting the numbers. And then people who are thinking about culture and beyond are maybe going to be easier to talk to when you talk about the circumstances for success. But you can't, if you only hit one of those or one or two of those, you're going to lose people. And we have to be careful not to disrespect that people are. It's just you only evolve when life forces you to, really. And it may be that people in their life stages haven't evolved, and so we need to be, as being human and humane, we need to make sure that we're bringing everyone along.
It sounds similar to the spiral dynamics world and some of the stuff in Teal, that there's a trap there of saying, well, I'm Teal and I'm more evolved than you, and when actually it's about recognizing the value of all of the stages and respecting them. And it's not as you say, it's not a hierarchy. It's not a case of I'm superior because I've reached this stage. So it's, really about being really aware and compassionate that it's natural and normal and totally okay for people to be at different stages depending on their life circumstances.
And people at later stages do have more options, and so we also can't ignore that. Like, there isn't. It's not random. Like, there is a progression. There is an evolution. So there's a kind of double challenge there of not being judgy, and also appreciating that, well, you do have more tools. You do have more perspectives. You've got a hard-won change in the way that you look at the world, but because you've got more options in the way that you approach things, and you need to be the more flexible one.
I want to shift to a sort of connected but slightly different topic around, you mentioned about including everyone, and I know that you're very passionate about power differences in society and how those show up in organizations, and diversity and equity and inclusion. What is your, this is a huge question. What is your take on all of that? what can we learn from? Because I think this is a topic that's coming up a lot more now in terms of organizations. I mean, you have, for a while, you've had the, in terms of traditional hierarchy type organizations, they've recognized that diversity and inclusion and stuff is important for the bottom line and blah, blah, blah. And in order to be competitive and hire people, if I be a bit cynical for a moment. But I think also I'm hearing like Frederick Laloux and a lot of other people talking about in the world of self-organizing that we need to shift more than just the manager-subordinate dynamic, that there are so many other power differences and dynamics going on, that if we can really shine a light on those in organizations, and perhaps they become all the more visible in a self-managing organization, then there's some real gold there in terms of deepening relationships, in terms of creating spaces for people. What's been your journey with that, and what learning can you share from that strand of your work?
So before I forget, there's something I've been thinking about and talking about with friends, that we tend to approach diversity, equity, inclusion, justice work, or businesses tend to approach it in terms of the bottom line and diversity of thought, and or because we should do it because it's the right thing, which I think is maybe a slightly better motive. But the thing that you don't know when you live in a reasonably monocultural environment is how amazing it is when you have an environment that's really inclusive, and you have people of colour and queer people and trans people and disabled people able to be themselves. Like, we bring, I say we, so as someone who has some marginalised identities and some dominant identities, the environment is amazing. There's some magic which is just missing from, like, dry toast organisations sometimes, and that's really difficult to convey, because the work to get there is, if you're really going to do it, is super emotional. And I was talking, so I do this work generally with my friend Soraya Aisha, who's my business partner in it. We run at the moment we kind of, it just exists as a hashtag, tickbox, TIKBOX, but we started off doing anti-racism work with white people in our lounge. So we invited some people around and we were experimenting with things. And we were talking the other day about how we are really, you move from ignorance, so literally not knowing or not caring, through to shoulds and shouldn'ts. 101, should use this language, shouldn't use that language. And then that's better than ignorance. So at least an organisation, people in an organisation are being respectful. But in order to become someone who people with marginalised identities can relax around and bring the magic that they have, you need to go through a whole range of emotional work where you unpick the internalized programming that you have. And it's tough work and long-term work, and it's something that we really that people underestimate inside organizations, and then also personally, that in order to create an organization where people with marginalized identities can bring their full self to work, that's a long-term cultural change. Just doing a little bit of unconscious bias training is laughable. Like, we literally all sit down and laugh about it. And it also, if you do have people who are different to you in fundamental ways, it does mean you may lose some of the coziness of your organization for you, because there are certain ways that we do things that so I went to ill-advisedly, I decided to go to a networking evening in London by quite a posh organisation, and nothing bad happened, but I was not welcome as a trans woman. I looked around the room. I mean, I should just walk straight out, but I got the train all the way to London, and I got a new outfit because it was quite posh. And I looked around the room, and I something in the room, I knew that these people had not done any work to unpick their internalized transphobia. No, and you can smell it. And black friends of mine have talked about white ways of organizing, white ways of running organizations. And the thing that you don't realize when you have a dominant identity is how much people with marginalized identities code switch towards you, how much we're working really hard, how much we're pretending to be able to fit in, and how exhausting that is. And so that the onus for the work needs to rest on the people with dominant identities, but it's actually not clear how you do that, because just empathizing your way in is only going to get you 10% of the way in. Like, I didn't know until I spoke to women friends of mine, and then more recently the Me Too movement, that how much street harassment women experience, both cis and trans women experience. I kind of thought it was a little bit, and then I realized how much was going on. I didn't realize how many microaggressions, how many small, not small emotionally, but regular microaggressions happen to people of color in this country as they're just getting on the bus and going to work and going to meetings, and how much people speak over people and for people and disbelieve people and disrespect people routinely every day. And so I think it also has a link to the action logics, because if we approach diversity, equity, inclusion, and I think those are important distinctions, justice, that through an expert lens, it's only going to take us so far. And really, in order for us to do this work, we need people who have a more interdependent action logic in order to be able to see the humanity, in order to have the humility to realize how much work there is to do. And I've also realized it as a trans woman. Like I'm just kind of announced my transition on 31st of March, which was Trans Day of Visibility this year. And I am still rooting out misogyny and transmisogyny inside me, even though, like, hello, I'm a trans woman. And so it comes up, and it's ways of processing and also ways of educating ourselves, that if we haven't read 10 articles or 2 books on racism, ableism, misogyny, trans and non-binary identities, classism, then we're really not actually that bothered about it, and so there's an education piece in there as well. So this is partly why I've been thinking about where's my place in the world, and I think partially my intervention point is nurturing people who are moving from independent to interdependent leadership, because we've got 2 crises. We've got the human rights crisis, or the human flourishing crisis, and then we've also got the planetary crisis that's fast coming upon us. And it's only people who have longer timelines and more empathy and more ability to spot patterns and more humility that are going to be people who can bring about those 2 things to avoid the possible apocalypse that's coming our way.
Yeah. Gosh, so many great things in what you just said. Something that comes to mind is what you pointed out about that, to really have these conversations beyond a kind of intellectual level, you know, let's do an anti-bias training or something, to really, at a different action logic, have a really human, compassionate, you know, what is it like living your life as who you are, and really understanding that you do have to give up a certain level of coziness and confront some awkwardness. I think the author says that in that book, Why I No Longer Talk to White People About Race, that, you know, a lot of white people say, like, yeah, but it's a bit awkward, isn't it? Like, bring up race, or, you know, don't want to. It's like, yeah, well, I think we can deal with a little bit of awkwardness, you know, for the greater good, given the kind of historical context.
And then the thing that, in addition to that, is it's not just awkwardness. It's like white people, we respond violently towards, like, furious. I was talking to the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at a law firm yesterday, and we were talking about how why it is hard to talk to white people about race. And if you're in the UK, it's good to read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Racism. That's a really key book which frames it in the UK context. Because sometimes our response is the fragility of our ability to talk about race comes out in fury and rage. And that means that if we're like, oh, people should just speak up, and like there's reasons why people aren't speaking up, because it is extremely unusual to find a white person who does not respond in a deeply defensive way. We tend to think of white people, we tend to think of racism as saying bad things about black and brown people, and it's like wildly deeper than that, and invisible to us. And until we start doing that education, we don't have a hope of creating an organization where not only you're going to hire people, but they're going to stay and be happy. And that's one of the important distinctions, is when you're looking at your organization, how you look at how many queer people, trans people, disabled people, people of color there are, but you also look at how long are they staying, and how much are they able to be themselves? And even that question about how happy are you, how much are you being yourself, are you creating an environment where it's okay to tell the truth? Because there's the conversations, the WhatsApp conversations that happen amongst marginalised people about our/their experience in the workplace, you would be amazed at the labour that goes on in order to just exist in the workplace and the world.
Yeah. What would you, given your experience, what can we do in organizations or communities to create safe spaces and to create an environment where people have the courage to speak the truth, and not in sort of, corridors or WhatsApp chats, but to really and for it to be heard?
I mean, fundamentally, it's about who are you employing at senior roles, and I know maybe we don't have senior roles, but in self-managing organizations, but who's actually, so you're not just including people, but people are actually making their own decisions about inclusion. And I've been thinking about this in terms of me coming out as a trans woman. I identified as non-binary for 3 or 4 years, and then before that, as a gay man. And I've been thinking about why I felt. Some people have said, "Oh, you're really brave," and I don't feel brave. And I've been thinking about, why is that? Why didn't I feel? I mean, sometimes I do feel like it's not totally straightforward. But all my clients have been lovely, all like both coaching clients and corporate clients. And I suppose I've seen people respond consistently positively to stuff around trans identity in my circle. And so it became less of a what will people think, like I already knew, but that meant that there was a consistency of response to things. And like, I suppose I also did it gradually. Like, I began to experiment with a little bit of makeup, and then I was wearing gender non-conforming clothes, so dresses or more clothes from the women's side. And so for several years had a slightly mixed femme and masculine, or whatever. I think the gender binary is made up rubbish. And saw that people still kept me as their coach, and clients still brought me in to run interventions and do facilitation and culture work, and so that they were still staying in contact with me. And then when I came out, clients then emailed me to go, "I've seen your blog post, and I just want to say, like, I'm really proud to have you as a coach." And so that's an incredibly precious thing, and very rare for trans people, particularly trans people of colour, to have that. I'm also older. I'm turned 44 on Friday, and so I have the protection of whiteness, and I have the protection of age, and I have the protection of choosing who I work with, which lots of people who work for organisations don't have that choice. Though also, when I created Candid Dialogue with some people at a client, people have said to me, "Well, I like you, but I think God thinks it's wrong." And so there are, like, there's a decision to be made with organisations to go, are you okay with just having a baseline of like overtly respectful behaviour towards marginalised people, or do you really want to win hearts and minds? And winning hearts and minds is a whole different challenge.
Yeah. I by the way, that blog that you're referring to is just gorgeous. I'm going to put the link in the episode when I publish it, because it's, for me, it was really, yeah, just powerful. And you wrote on your website as well a phrase which I really like about, you know, as a trans woman, I know a thing or two about transitions. So I'm curious, you know, this kind of deeply personal transition that you've gone through and are going through, has that impacted the way that you view your work and the world, and how you approach these ideas that we've been talking about?
I mean, on one level they do, because it's part of me. I am talking a lot to leaders about, so I had a coaching client yesterday who I was talking about finding their way of doing things. And they were saying they were working in a particular field, and they feel like they want to develop their expertise and become someone who really knows this area, which they've only really just moved into, but they're not really book reading people. Like they know that they're going to read a page and wander away. And so I was talking with them about, so what would be the thing? Could it be podcasts? Could it be audiobooks? Could it be you follow a bunch of people on Twitter and then follow the links and have conversations? Are you more real life conversation person? Like, do you want to have meetups and Skypes and things? And I suppose I think I'm answering your question backwards, but as someone who's talked about that for a long time, I realized that I needed to be modeling that. And I suppose this is quite an extreme way of modeling it. That we go, if you're... Look, we potentially got some really serious stuff about to happen in the world, and is really, and actually there's a whole bunch of stuff which is happening for millions of people. And this is not time for us to not be bringing every ounce of magic that we have in the world. This is not time for us to be allowing capitalism, allowing the corporate life to stop us bringing everything that we can to the challenges that are in front of us. And maybe you can't be at the front line of dealing with the climate crisis or changing policies for marginalised people at work, but can you, moment to moment, bring a genuine awareness and a compassionate awareness? Are you listening properly? Are you being as present as you can be? Are you dealing with your own stuff? Are you educating yourself about people who are different than you? And because we need more people who are doing that kind of internal revealing. Being a trans woman, it's really funny. I've got a meeting with the doctor today after we're talking about supporting me in hormones. And I expected when I got to this stage that I would feel different, and actually I just feel more me. And so I still have the same brain and same heart and the same gut that I had when I was living as a gay man. And there's a magic in authenticity, which is an overused word, but there's a magic in being present and in being able to walk through the world fully as you, and bring in as many people as you can, and be as humble and ready. There's a beautiful phrase that a mentor of mine uses, that they say, being vulnerable to transformation. Like, are you being vulnerable to transformation? In fact, when I was on the learning marathon, a friend crocheted some phrases that she for each person of the 12 people who's on the learning marathon, and the one that she crocheted for me was "listen to transform," because I talk quite a lot about the levels of listening that are in theory U, about listening, which are basically just waiting, listening for debate, listening for dialogue, which is better, so listening for the feelings of the other person. But are you listening in that deeper way where you're allowing yourself to go, how might I change in this conversation? How might I change today? I've got a little badge from an author, his name's going to escape me now, a YA author, that it says, everything changes today. Today is the day everything changes. I can't remember, but it just reminds me sometimes to go. Sometimes we look ahead at our day and think we know how it's going to go, and if we can hold a space to go, I don't know who I'm going to be tonight, then it allows some magic in, even if we're doing really ordinary things.
Yeah. I had moments of nearly crying there as you were talking. I think you model so beautifully all the things that you're talking about. It really comes across with you, just like energetically.
Thank you.
Gosh, how to wrap up such a profound conversation. I suppose, like, I'm thinking about people who are listening, who are on transition journeys of their own, of all kinds of different transitions, I imagine. Whether it's personal transitions, whether it's transitioning to a teal or a self-managing organization, whether it's transitioning to a new action logic. What sort of parting advice or words of wisdom or encouragement could you offer listeners?
When I first started my transition, so when I first came across non-binary people, so people who don't identify as male or female, who aren't male or female in their sense of self, I thought it was just ridiculous. Like I was at that stage where we talk about ignorance and rolling your eyes. Like I just thought it was silly. And then I gradually followed a bunch of people on Twitter and got to see that there were a whole bunch of people who were living that way, and not just young white people either, but a whole bunch of people. And then I became a roller derby referee. So roller derbies are this wild. Started off as a women's sport, but very gender inclusive, and I was a referee, and partially because I just loved roller skating, and there were a few people there who were trans and non-binary, and so I began to see people around me, and then there was just a whisper inside me that my body wanted different fabrics on it. So I felt like I wanted something swooshier than I was wearing, and I began to realize that I would really quite like to wear some mascara. Sidebar, I understand how using the tools of the patriarchy that oppress women to express my full self. Trans people are very aware of this
irony.
And I'm constantly at the moment navigating between, if I express myself in a very feminine way, I'm worried that women are going to say, being a woman isn't all just having painted nails and wearing heels and having makeup on, Whereas if I don't, then people will treat me going, well, you really expect me to treat you like a woman, but you don't look much like one. So there's something where I'm finding to go, what do I want to wear today? How do I want to present? And sometimes it's just another example of people policing how women appear in the world, or non-cis men appear in the world. and there began to be this whisper of I wanted this thing and I didn't really know what it was. And then I started talking to my partners about it and friends and just saying, I really think there's something here. And I followed it, and I've ended up, I lived as non-binary for a while, and then last July, I went to an event with some trans women, and something in my body just called out to the way that they were, and then that's when I knew. And it took me another 9 months of thinking about it and doing therapy to go, do I really want this? And the thing that I learned from that is it was seeing people around me who were fully expressing themselves that allowed me to fully express myself. And now people are messaging me to go, by you being so fully yourself, it helps me to be fully myself. And I think that's that funny thing about the human journey, isn't it? That we can, the more we model how we want to be in the world, the more we can be a model. And I'm really, I'm super aware that I stand on the shoulders of decades and decades of gender non-conforming and trans people, and then particularly the shoulders of young people who are existing right now, who are really pushing the boundaries of what it means to be a human in terms of gender. And so if you do have that inkling, allow it to blossom slowly, but don't ignore it. So if you are going, I really have an instinct that this is what I want to do with my life, or this is how I want to begin to change my organization, it's probably important not to jump in with both feet, but to listen quietly to that and go, what's my next step? What will be a small step to test this, to see what people's responses are? And I suppose, ironically, that also means people are probably going to come along the journey with you, if you're allowing them to catch up. People need time to process. Sometimes it's something that I forget, is that I've been thinking about this for years, and for some people it's brand new, and there's an element of me having to be a little bit patient with people, and so that if you've been thinking about self-management for ages, or you've been thinking about doing something that seems a little bit out there, then you may have to remember that other people haven't been thinking about it for so long. And so how do you go slowly so that people can stay with you?
Yeah, so listen to the whisper and follow it step by step. Like that. Meg, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate you sharing both your knowledge and your personal experiences in a way that for sure is going to model something very inspirational for people listening. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been an honour to be here, because you've interviewed a bunch of people whose books I have and who I see as mentors and people who I really admire. So it's really an honour to be amongst their company too.